You know, they say history is written by the winners. That's why the good guys win all the battles, because the bad guys aren't left there to tell their own story. One of the things that frustrates me as a Canadian, and this has been the case for decades, is that the stories of our conservative or freedom-oriented heroes were written by their opponents. So when Stephen Harper was the prime minister, there was an orgy of attack books about him. How dare conservatives have a champion? He must have his name blackened. And I just think it's the same in comedy, the same in filmmaking, the same in TV shows. For some reason, those cultural industries are overwhelmingly left-wing or at best liberal, very few conservatives in that space. And so when someone from our side, and by our side, I don't mean a partisan conservative, I mean someone who just cares about freedom, cares about ordinary folks, not just the incumbent elites. When someone from our side actually writes a book about, for example, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party and the likely next prime minister, I think it behooves us to say, this is a miracle, it's a unicorn, we have to support it, because when has that ever happened? And so you may know that I am introducing our favorite guy, author, journalist, my friend Andrew Lawton, because he just wrote a book called Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, and it's a bestseller. Andrew Lawton, great to see you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're a good writer, you're a good journalist, you're a professional. It's a good book on its own merits. But I want to tell you the truth, even if it wasn't a good book, I would still say it behooves every conservative to buy it, because we need conservative. And I don't mean that like you're a party man.
Yeah. No, it's a small C, conservatism, yes.
It's so how did you know that this book was going to be so needed? When Poilievre became the new leader and you thought, okay, we got to tell the story?
It was during the leadership race. So just as a bit of context, I wrote a book about the Freedom Convoy in 2022, and that book just became this huge success, even though Indigo had blacklisted it, the mainstream media would not give it a lick of attention. And
it was a best-selling book, but they blackballed it.
It was the number one bestseller for, I think, 7 weeks. And that's on the Globe and the Toronto Star.
And they wouldn't even review it.
They wouldn't even review it. So I think what it showed there is what you said, that there is an appetite for these stories in Canada, irrespective of what the media says is the official title of the summer. And I think in general, there's also an issue in Canada, and that we don't have people telling these stories. In the U.S., you have political columnists and talk radio people and Fox personalities that are releasing a book a year. Not all of them are good, but they're committed to doing it, and there's a market.
They're filling the pipeline, at least.
Yeah.
You got a choice.
Whereas in Canada, who are the conservative historians? I mean, Tom Flanagan wrote about the Harper campaign in 2004 and 2006 afterwards, but that was basically it.
So few.
Yeah.
So few.
And so for me, when I was watching the leadership rallies that Poilievre held, these rallies that would bring out thousands of people, I was looking around and seeing, much like I had seen with the Freedom Convoy, there's something bigger here that's happening that needs to be explained. And that was sort of when the idea started. As he became the leader, as I saw that momentum continue, as I saw Poilievre really campaign as a very different type of person from his predecessors and as a different person in Canadian politics, I was pretty convinced there's a story here that needs to be told to introduce this guy to Canadians before the mainstream media gets their hands on it.
I think one of the most important things you did in the book, and I'd like your reaction to this, is you didn't just digest what had already been written about the guy. Because like I say, that's got a bias built in, because it would be written by CBC, Canadian Press, Toronto Star.
Yeah.
So if you were just going to say, well, all I know about Pierre Poilievre is what's being published to date, even if you try and have a balanced book, it's not going to be balanced, because garbage in, garbage out. You did a ton of primary research, by which I mean interviewing people. Even interviewing people. I mean, you talk to me.
Even you. You're a part of that.
I know, because I knew the guy. I mean, I worked with him 20 plus years ago. So you did meticulous research. I want you to talk about that, because with books like this, people say, oh, I already know about Pierre Poilievre. Do you? Or do you just know what the CBC and Althea Raj and Rosemary Barton say about him? Because if you're just consuming the news, you have one perspective. Give me some examples of things that you uncovered or discovered that are not part of the common discussion of Pierre Poilievre.
So I didn't want it to just be his Wikipedia page extended to book form, where it just, takes any mention of him in the news and throws it together in a timeline. At the same time, I also know that Poilievre's success in part has been because he's brought new people into politics. So I wanted it to be accessible in a way that it does cover old ground for people that don't know anything about him. Some of it will be repetitive, but there was a focus that I had on talking to people that have been involved, not just going back to when he was elected in 2004, but before then. I mean, people may not know, even in your own audience, that he was your communications director when you were an alliance candidate in Calgary Southwest.
He was young and I was young.
Yeah, and that was just this chaotic time in Canadian politics. And that was something that had to be in the book. And that's something that a lot of people, it's out there, but a lot of people now in your audience and in his might not have known.
I forgot about some of that.
You did. You were, I was telling you stuff when I sat down to interview you. And
I forgot that I had co-written an article with him.
Yeah.
It's like,
because I had asked you for a copy, and you were like you were looking in the same place as I was.
Let me interject and say, I've known Pierre Poilievre, as you've just indicated, for almost 30 years. And what I tell people who ask me about him, I say, look, no one knows what's in a man's heart.
Mm-hmm.
But he has been saying the same principled things since he was in college. So maybe he'll have a change of heart when he's in power. I don't know. We can't predict the future. But if past behavior is a predictor of future behavior, I've known him since he was in his early 20s. And he has been saying the same thing ever since. Is that what you found?
And I would actually go even before that, because when you talk about things that I found that weren't really part of the public discourse already, I found letters to the editor he wrote even as a teenager, an op-ed he would write for the Calgary Herald here and there. And he had not just a principled conservatism back then when he was talking about, opposing the capital gains tax to bring it into the current context and other things like, small government. He was even criticizing conservative leaders at the time.
That takes some courage for a youngster.
Yeah, including the Ralph Klein government. Ralph Klein is held up as being this, granddaddy of Western conservatism, but Poilievre was saying publicly, well, there are these people in this party that aren't actually real conservatives. And for a guy that wanted to work in politics, that was a pretty bold, maybe foolish, but I'd say pretty bold thing. So going back to even his teenage years, he was saying the exact same things he's saying now on the issues that matter and on that core idea and on freedom. I mean, he wrote an essay in university, which the prompt that he was given was, as Prime Minister, I would.
Right. That was a contest, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he was a finalist. He didn't win. He was a finalist. But the title of his essay, and it was run by Magna, was Building Canada Through Freedom. And I got my hands on that essay. You read the essay, and even some of the phrases are almost identical to things he said when he announced his leadership run in 2022.
Wow.
And that was, of course, 23 years later.
On the one hand, that shows a remarkable focus and continuity and reliability, and that's a sign of character. What about those who would say, well, look, even since he was a lad in diapers, he was thinking about politics. He's a political creature through and through. He wasn't a small businessman. He wasn't in the army. I guess it's an American experience more than a Canadian one, I regret. What do you think about that? I mean, and I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying you remind me that even when he was a student, he was this way.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
No, it's a fair criticism. And, the book is subtitled A Political Life for a reason, because his life has been about politics. Yeah. He had a very brief stint working, in the private sector. He didn't really build a career there. He was a staffer, and then he was a candidate. And then for the last 20 years, he's been a member of parliament. So I think it's a legitimate criticism. And I think
I don't even think I'm saying it as a criticism.
Well, I think it is a legitimate criticism, because on one hand, he's talking about, the ordinary middle-class experiences of Canadians. Most Canadians haven't been making a six-figure salary since their 20s.
Right.
But I also point out that the career politician label tends to be overlooked when people like the politics of the person. And it's the kind of thing, when you're going after a liberal, you say, oh, he's a career politician. When you're going after a conservative, you say, oh, he's a career politician. But you only do it if you don't like them. That tends to be it. I think I was more interested not in making a judgment of is that good or bad. I was more interested in figuring out why it was. And I talked to some of the people that had worked with him very early on in his career. And it was interesting that he had actually spoken to the MP he sat next to when he took his seat for the first time, Joe Preston. and said, Joe, I'm a little bit concerned that, you're here, you're a business guy. I don't have that experience. What can I do to learn a little bit more about that? And it was some of those conversations that led him to invest in property and just have something that wasn't politics on the side.
So he'd have to worry about paperwork and taxes and just all the things that an owner of something has to.
Yeah, and he was aware that it was a bit of a blind spot, that it was a bit of a gap in his experience. And he had also, at one point, which I found fascinating, and again, had never been reported elsewhere, talked to someone who'd volunteered on his campaign about leaving politics, about serving a couple of terms, leaving, and then coming back and maybe being finance minister or, heaven forbid, prime minister. And there was a realization that sunk in. This was the sense that I got, that, well, if I leave, what if my seat's not there when I come back? What if it's not actually as easy to transition back into it? So I could see how he ended up in that path dependency. And again, the book is not to make a pro or anti-Poilievre point. It's just to talk about who he is and tell that story.